someone who implemented the agreed framework. Since
I told you you're part of the legal framework.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I must have not been listening. Whenever someone says that, I think to myself, that's great. You know, I implemented an agreement that everyone thinks failed. I don't think it failed, actually, but that's a separate issue. So thanks a lot. I am happy to be here today, and I wanted to focus on the current situation, no surprise, and particularly the lull in North Korean testing, the upcoming exercises, USROK exercises, and the 2018 Olympics. And what I want to talk about is fashioning a policy towards North Korea over the next 6 to 12 months. I'm not going to talk about sanctions. I'm not going to talk about military measures. Some of that may be appropriate, particularly sanctions, but I want to focus on diplomacy because a lot of people don't talk about that, and particularly in Washington, where the fixation is on sanctions and military options. I think it's really important that we think about the next 6 to 12 months and what we really want to do, and focus on the diplomatic side, because we may have an opportunity here. There's no guarantee, of course. I always feel I have to say that. In the Obama administration, when people raise the idea of diplomacy, the question would always be, well, do you think it can succeed? And the answer was always, well, we don't know for sure. And I think that's the case here, too. We don't know for sure, but I think it's definitely worth a try, given the alternatives we're facing. So, where are we now? Everyone's talking about the current lull in North Korean testing and why is there a lull, and of course no one has any idea why there's a lull. There's a lot of speculation, and you know, we used to spend hours speculating about whether North Korea would give up its nuclear weapons when I was in the State Department, and of course there was never any answer. So I'm not going to really speculate about it. And we all know what the different possibilities are. They could be doing it deliberately to send a signal. It could be that they're just digesting information from the previous tests. Or there may be other reasons that we just don't really know. What I would say is I think it's very likely that they will resume testing. And the issue is when. And of course, once again, we can't predict. But as a ballpark figure, I think it would be in the next 3 to 6 months. We've seen in the past that there's been a pause this time of year. Sometimes it's been short, sometimes it's been longer. Last year, I think it was fairly long. After September, they paused for about 5 months. Previous years, not so long. They've had long-range missile tests in December. They've had nuclear tests in January. They've had long-range missile tests February and March. So, you know, it's really hard to predict, except we do have a window now. One of the things I wanted to say is just looking beyond this period where we can think about diplomacy is to the period where they do resume testing, tensions are going to spike again. They're going to go up again. I mean, we've been through this cycle. I don't know, I've probably been doing this too long. I feel like we've been through it 1,000 times. You know, tensions go up, everyone's paying attention, testing stops, everyone sort of isn't paying attention. So we're in that period now where testing has stopped. And once it starts again, I think there are probably 2 main scenarios, 2 alternatives we will face. And I'm talking a lot about the United States. Thank you. The first one is, of course, that there will be a conflict, whether it's deliberate or not. And of course, there's the danger of miscalculation. But I think that's one scenario. I'm not predicting it's going to happen. But, you know, there's already a narrative floating around Washington which lays the intellectual groundwork for military action. And the narrative is basically Kim Jong-un is irrational. He will use his growing arsenal to push the U.S. off the peninsula and reunite Korea on his terms. So we need to stop that from happening before his arsenal grows. There are, of course, a lot of different scenarios out there for executing military options, but the one you hear the most about is shooting down an ICBM test. And the theory is that if you shoot down an ICBM over the Pacific Ocean, the military response will be much more limited. There's a lot of holes in this narrative. I'm not going to go through them all. One of them is, could we shoot down an ICBM over the Pacific? There are lots of people who are very skeptical about that. Another is, well, is Kim Jong-un irrational? I think there are a lot of people now who are skeptical about that. And is his goal to reunite the Korea on his own terms, and could he push the U.S. off the peninsula somehow? Once again, I think there are problems with that logic. But nevertheless, it's out there. It's part of, I would say, part of the U.S. administration that is sort of making that argument. A second alternative is that the Trump administration is a paper tiger, that it backs down after the president has made so many threats and promises about what he's going to do if North Korea builds an ICBM. Or we might fail to shoot down the ICBM, or we might not even try. I mean, I don't know. There are lots of different possibilities, but the threats will be exposed as being hollow, and there would be an enormous blow to our credibility, U.S. credibility, that could have serious short and long-term implications. That's not just with the North Koreans, who I suspect even now think our threats are fairly hollow. But it's also broader international ramifications beyond Northeast Asia, in terms of our security guarantees in other parts of the world, particularly Europe. But if you come back to this part of the world, what does that do in terms of the credibility of our security guarantee to our allies, and particularly South Korea, where that guarantee has been under a lot of stress because of North Korea's growing nuclear arsenal? And we all know about the discussion over extended deterrence and how to bolster our commitment through possibly the redeployment of tactical nuclear weapons, maybe even South Korea considering building its own. I understand that the current government is in no way in favor of that, but what about the next South Korean president if it's someone who's now advocating all of the above? That urge, I think, would be fueled by the failure of the Trump administration to back up its threats against North Korea. Neither of these scenarios leads to a place we want to go. The first one is obvious. Second one, we would avoid, of course, a horrific outcome of a conflict, but the long-term implications for the United States, in Asia and in Europe, I think, would be fairly enormous. So what about the diplomatic side of things? I would argue that we need to be thinking about ways to take advantage of the open window that we have now because of the three events I mentioned a few minutes ago: the testing lull, the upcoming U.S. ROK exercise in February, and the 2018 Olympics. So all of these events give us an opportunity to think about some serious diplomatic initiatives. And I think we can learn a great deal from history. And by that I mean the Reagan administration's policies towards North Korea. So no one is sort of moving their hand to their head, scratching their heads about what does he mean. But yes, I do mean the Reagan administration. So I'm sure almost everyone has forgotten about the Reagan administration's policies towards North Korea. And that was the time when U.S. policy towards the North started to shift away from the 30 years of confrontation that started, of course, with the Korean War, started to shift away from that to some sort of limited engagement with the North Koreans. And the 1988 Olympics were key. The Seoul Olympics were key to that mix. The Reagan policy was called the Modest Initiative, and it was constructed around the idea that if North Korea did nothing to upset the Olympics, the U.S. would take unilateral steps towards engagement. Well, as we all know, the North didn't upset the Olympics, and the White House moved forward with a number of measures to ease the confrontation with North Korea. It encouraged unofficial visits by North Koreans, non-governmental visits by North Koreans to the U.S. It eased financial regulations that impeded travel to the North by American citizens, gave permission for limited commercial exports of humanitarian goods to the North, and it gave U.S. diplomats permission to have substantive contacts with North Koreans in neutral settings. As I said, all of these were unilateral. There was nothing explicit asked of the North Koreans, except that its response should be positive and constructive. And the U.S. listed what it would consider positive, constructive, and constructive. And there were 5 items, none of them shocking. Progress in North-South dialogue, return of U.S. servicemen missing in action remains, eliminating anti-U.S. propaganda, implementing confidence-building measures along the DMZ, and credible assurances that North Korea had abandoned terrorism as an instrument of state policy. Of course, times have changed quite a bit in the past 30 years, and we're facing a much more difficult challenge today. But if you look at the Reagan approach and think about the current situation, maybe it's possible to construct a joint U.S. ROK approach, tension reduction, and confidence-building measures around ensuring a peaceful Olympics. And those measures would also serve a broader policy of trying to start a real negotiation over the security issues, the challenges facing us. What do I mean by that? What are the specific pieces of this policy? And I have to admit, I haven't thought through every little piece, so if anyone has specific recommendations on this, that'd be great. I'd like to hear more about what you think. First and foremost, and this is not new, and I know people are thinking about this, the key is, of course, that we need to be willing to suspend or modify the February joint exercises, U.S. ROK joint exercises. And then, as part of that, we need to be willing to enter into preliminary bilateral talks. The United States needs to be willing to do that on issues of mutual concern following the Olympics with North Korea. Quite frankly, I say issues of mutual concern because that's the North Korean formulation that we hear from them. People in the United States will say, oh no, we can't do that unless they say, you know, they're willing to talk about denuclearization. Well, you know, it's not a shock to the North Koreans that the minute they sit down at a table with a bunch of Americans, all they're going to hear are the words denuclearization, denuclearization, denuclearization. They're ready for that. So in my mind, this is a very small hurdle. And given the current situation that we're facing, I think we just need to get over that fixation and move into these discussions. In terms of suspending or modifying the February joint exercises, I think Key Resolve Fall Eagle could either be canceled or significantly scaled back. The Fall Eagle events could be postponed until later in the year, and it could be a standalone exercise. It doesn't have to join the Key Resolve. I'm not just saying this because, you know, as a civilian, I probably wouldn't have a lot of credibility if I was in a room with military men talking about this. I'm reflecting what military men tell me. Men who have been involved in planning the exercises and working at PACOM. And I wrote an article with one of them that was in the National Interest, the magazine The National Interest. I guess it's a couple of months ago now, that basically laid out the argument. This would have to be done before mid-January, and I think that's when the critical cancellation date, what the military calls the CCD, occurs. And that's determined essentially on projected movement schedules, money expenditures, and the like. So if we take action or start moving in that direction before mid-January, I think that would help lessen the opposition, such as it might be, from the Pentagon. In return for those steps, the North Koreans should respect the moratorium on testing. Whether they're doing that now or not, they should continue doing it. And they should agree to start these preliminary discussions on security issues. I sort of see this as the framework of whatever measures are taken, and there may be more confidence-building measures that can somehow be part of this mix, intended to reduce tensions before and after the Olympics, and once again to reinforce that atmosphere for the security talks. And I'm sure there are a number of things on the North-South front that can be part of this initiative, and they should be, because this should be a joint initiative. A lot of people will say, well, gee, we need to sit down and negotiate this. You know, I'm not so sure. The Reagan administration didn't sit down and negotiate it, it just did it. And the North Koreans responded. So if we could figure out a way of doing this unilaterally, and it wasn't negotiated, but somehow depended on reciprocal responses from the North Koreans, then I would say we should do that. I don't see many downsides to doing this in this situation. The downside is the North Koreans won't respond. If they don't respond, that's fine. Then we can call them out on that. I mean, this isn't an issue of, gee, we have to have negotiations, we're begging for it. It's also a political game. And the game is to make if the North Koreans don't respond, to make them look guilty. That's the point. So that's the first part of the strategy for the next 3 to 6 months. let's say this succeeds. Then what? You know, let's say we get past the Olympics, all these measures result in a ratcheting down of tensions, and you know, we're into this phase of about to begin about talks. What happens after that? I'm not going to go through the step-by-step explanation of talks about talks. I'm happy to do that in answering anyone's questions. It's been written about a lot. You know, I wrote about it recently with a friend, Suzanne DiMaggio, in the New York Times. It's all there. It's pretty straightforward. The point I did want to make, and this is a big potential stumbling block if we get beyond talks about talks. And it's going to sound like common sense, but I'm going to say it anyway because you don't hear about it a lot. And that is that we aren't going to get something for nothing. There was an idea in previous administrations that we could take advantage of North Korea somehow, that, you know, they were weak, they were economically isolated, and so we could take advantage of that to drive a really good deal. Well, I think, you know, we have enough history now to understand that that just isn't true. It's not going to work that way. And it's been very clear, extremely clear, in my contacts with the North Koreans over the past decade, that as their nuclear program and missile program has grown, the price of a diplomatic solution has gone up. Once again, logical, but I think a lot of people need to be reminded of that. And you know, the most obvious example is that, you know, I can remember discussions 10 years ago with North Koreans about their space launch program. And they were very open to solutions such as the one that the Clinton administration suggested, where, you know, they wouldn't be launching space launch vehicles. Another country would launch their satellites for them. Well, I mean, we've all seen what's happened over the past 10 years in terms of that program. They used to say it was very serious. We used to laugh at them and say, this isn't serious. They don't have serious satellites. They've got these clunky rockets. Well, now we see it is serious. And the point is, the price has gone way up. It's going to be a tough nut to crack, and we may not like the solutions. One solution may be to somehow carve out a space for their space launch program, in which we can get assurance that it isn't contributing to an ICBM program. That's quite possible, but it flies in the face of the logic we've deployed over the past decade or more that space launch vehicles equals ICBMs. The other issue here is that the technical challenges of securing some of the steps we want, and of course the main one you hear about is a freeze on their nuclear program that follows a test moratorium. The technical challenges are going to be very difficult to deal with, and that's particularly if we define a freeze as including North Korea's production of fissile material. You know, we're in this period now where there's no testing, but, you know, I bet you every week or two the North Koreans are churning out another nuclear weapon. They don't need to test to do that. All they need to do is to produce fissile material and put the weapon together. So this is something we're going to have to really tackle. And I bring this up because in the past, you know, if you look at our diplomacy, particularly during the Bush administration, the second term of the Bush administration, We were focused on technical solutions, which is good. You know, technical solutions are important, but we never really paid enough attention to the underlying political causes of confrontation. So one could argue that the Bush administration's second-term effort to deal with the nuclear challenge collapsed because of the lack of understanding and attention to the underlying political challenges that were driving North Korea. And you could also argue, I believe, that the Leap Day deal, the Obama administration's Leap Day deal in 2012, which was also seriously flawed in and of itself, also collapsed because we didn't pay enough attention to the underlying political problems. So I mention all of this because I think we're at a stage now where if we get into that next phase of diplomacy, we need to stop thinking about what's the least we can do to get what we want, and we need to think bigger and better than that. On the other hand, I want to argue that we need to be careful and prudent when we do that and not go to one extreme after being at the other where we want to give very little to get either very little or get a lot. And when I say we need to be prudent and careful, you know, nowadays I see something I never thought I would see written by some U.S. experts that, you know, maybe we should consider withdrawing U.S. troops from the peninsula in order to get a freeze. I think that's ridiculous. You know, decouple. Why don't we voluntarily decouple in order to stop this ICBM program? I think that's ridiculous. And quite frankly, I don't think the North Koreans would expect that, but they'd certainly accept it if we offered it. So I think we need to be very careful about how we think big and not go to the other extreme. Of course, there are people who say we should drop the idea of denuclearization. I don't agree with that either. So we need to stop swinging the pendulum back and forth and find somewhere in between. I just had a few suggestions. I need to think about this some more, quite honestly, but one suggestion is think about starting a process of establishing diplomatic relations with North Korea. I'm not the first person to come up with this idea. I know James Clapper a few months ago mentioned it here when he was here in Seoul. I think it's a great idea. As long as we're careful and we embed that in a process whose objective is to establish a nuclear-free Korean peninsula, and the first step is a real freeze. We could throw into the mix starting to plan for rolling back sanctions. We need a game plan for that because it's not easy to do that. And we, of course, this is obvious, we should agree to immediately begin negotiations on a permanent peace treaty and immediately to issue a multilateral statement that the Korean War is over, the armistice needs to be replaced, and we can begin negotiations on that. The last thing I want to mention is an idea that actually has been brought up by the North Koreans, that in the context of this framework of moving down the road to a permanent peace agreement, we should propose beginning negotiations on conventional force reductions on the peninsula, as well as confidence-building measures accompanying that. You know, who would have thought? I would have said, gee, you know, I never would have thought of suggesting that, but the North Koreans have suggested that. If you think about it, I can understand their logic. I think one of the things they're interested in is shifting resources to their economy and And certainly if they can cut back on their conventional forces, that'll help them do that. So in closing,